I'm not sure if I'll put the link in again just in case for the recording purpose. But basically the link should, please correct me if I'm wrong, it should direct you to a PDF that is then linked on the court's website. And it's a 3-page PDF. I would love to believe that there's a future in Virginia's, for Virginia, where our court system doesn't just simply have a website that is a PDF linked within a PDF within a PDF, but I don't know when that's going to happen. So instead, if you just scroll to the bottom of that PDF, so there should be 3 pages, and then if you get all the way to the bottom, there are like links linked at the very, very end. So they're all blue, all hyperlinked, and each one is a link to 2 different things per set of maps. So one is going to be a link to, say, the congressional map PDF, and then an interactive congressional map, then a PDF of the state Senate, and an interactive state Senate map. And then the same thing for the House of Delegates. And then the very last one is what they call the final memorandum. And that's the thing that I really like to call attention to, because I think the biggest concern that a lot of folks have with the maps and the map drawing process is sort of like the why behind why decisions and why maps get drawn the way they get drawn. So the special masters, and I agree with whoever said it, it is a very strange term that we use, and not a big fan of it, but it's what we got to use apparently. The special masters did write a 63-page memo detailing all of the decisions they made, and very similar to what Brent Tarter had written in that letter, is that it was very clear that throughout the public hearing process, and even in the public hearings for the commission process, there were very specific things that people from the public had come forward and said, hey, I really, really want this to be X, Y, and Z because I live here and this is really what I want. And a lot of those things were taken into consideration by the special masters. A perfect example of this is the city of Lynchburg, which as of this moment is currently represented by 3 state senators. And I honestly just give a ton of praise to the residents of Lynchburg, Virginia, for just coming out in forces, probably better than we saw anywhere else in the state, that just came forward and said, like, hey, we really want a single representative because it's really confusing to have 3 state senators and never really know where the lines are. So now Lynchburg is a consistent and cohesive city represented by 1 state senator. So I say all that to say that the special masters memorandum really does detail why they made the decisions that they made. So I'm not going to go through 63 pages with you guys, because I know that that was probably not what anyone would want to do on a Wednesday night. But I would just say, like, if that's something that you're like thinking of doing a deep dive into why the special masters did the things they did, it's really helpful to look at. The other thing that I think is really helpful, and one of the pieces in thinking through this, is to remember that there are 2 different kinds of gerrymandering. One is the sort of like the textbook definition that I think we most often think of, which is political gerrymandering or partisan gerrymandering. So that means when different areas are cut up in ways that give an unfair advantage to one political party or another. So that's typically when we hear the term gerrymandering, that's what that is referring to. Equally problematic is racial gerrymandering. And so what that means is where different areas are cut up and carved up in one of 2 ways that make it so that very specific communities of color cannot successfully elect candidates of their choice to office. So way number 1 is what's called packing. These 2 terms rhyme, so they're relatively easy to remember. So packing is where, and we've seen this, Virginia is actually a textbook case of having had a long history of packing, where previous map drawers specifically and intentionally drew together districts that had an overwhelming majority of Black residents, so that other districts could not be drawn with Black residents, so that other communities were denied the opportunity to elect candidates of choice for Black residents. So that's packing. So when we think of packing, we think of usually districts that usually hit somewhere in the ballpark of like a 70% or higher population of one single community. And in Virginia, that more often than not is with Black residents. And so that's one type of racial gerrymandering. The other type is cracking. And so what that means, and again, Virginia has a long history of cracking, is where instead of sort of like drawing a district that is predominantly Black or predominantly Latino, which is another something that Virginia also has been guilty of in recent years, what map drawers will do is they will draw so many districts with such specific intent to sort of siphon away very specific community members, so that no district within a specific area is over a 50% threshold of a single community, so that no district is majority minority, and that therefore no district can successfully elect candidates of choice for a specific community of color. So those are the multiple ways of gerrymandering. So again, political, racial. The memo is really helpful in discerning whether or not we're going to see risks of either of these types of gerrymandering, because it goes through and talks about, and it literally does this with congressional, state Senate, and state House, where every single district that has been drawn is compared on what the percentage of different, they use the term minority, just to be clear, so specific minority communities, their language, and then they list what a single community's percentage of each district is. So you can see where are the majority Black districts, if there are majority, say, Asian districts, if there are majority Latino districts in the state. And then you can also see the partisan breakdown. And the goal of seeing these tables, and the way that the memo is outlined, you'll see the congressional ones first, then the state Senate, and then the state House. So it basically goes from the smallest number of districts to then the largest number of districts. And the way that you'll be able to see these things, and you'll be able to see sort of like from a pretty user-friendly capacity, whether or not there are any red flags, either from a racial gerrymandering or a political gerrymandering perspective. And by and large, there are not what I would describe as red flags. I think the overwhelming summary of these maps is that they are overwhelmingly adequate. They are nothing that I think any political party or any community is gonna run down the street saying we won. They are overwhelmingly both as exciting and unexciting to all factions as possible, which I think for many people is probably considered a victory. In terms of the partisan side, one source that I think does a really solid job of not just comparing and analyzing maps that the special masters have produced and confirmed, but also comparing them in comparison to what we have today, is VPAP, which I'm assuming everyone is familiar with, but if not, just let me know and I'll happily do a little debrief on VPAP. But I'm just going to drop the link for VPAP's analysis into the chat. The reason I like VPAP is because they make everything very visually friendly, and I'm a very visual person. So highly recommend just taking a second to look at, and I think you should be able to see the congressional, the state House, and the state Senate through that link. But basically what you should be able to see is that everything moved a little bit more to Democrats' favor with the new maps. The caveat that I would, add to that is that I think that there could have been a case made for the House of Delegates map to move even further to Democrats' advantage. And the special masters even explicitly noted that in their memo, is that in the process of protecting specific communities of interest and specific comments and testimony that had been provided by the public, they did explicitly say that they felt that the House of Delegates map did slightly favor Republicans more than the state should necessarily see, given demographics and election results that we've seen over the last years. That doesn't mean that the Republicans have an advantage to win the House of Delegates moving forward. It just means that the Republicans have more opportunity to win seats that they necessarily should have if everything else was not a variable and they were just focusing on partisanship. But of course, they focus on so many different variables, so partisanship is just one of many. The other site that I really, really recommend as an option to analyze the maps is, and I think this is the right link, I hope. It looks a little clunky, but it is from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. Yeah. And the way that they analyze maps, I find helpful and not helpful. That isn't to say that they're not helpful. It's just that they use a couple different criteria that I would say are not really helpful for Virginians living and breathing the effects of redistricting. So there are a couple grades that they give. One is partisan fairness. That's definitely a grade I would keep an eye on. They also give a grade called competitiveness. Competitiveness is the grade that I would say everyone should just readily dismiss, because what it means is how close the aggregate number of districts is to making every district have a 50% chance likelihood of electing a Democrat and a 50% chance likelihood of electing a Republican, which I think we can all agree that's not a really good metric for scoring districts, because if a district or if an area is particularly Democratic or particularly Republican, we don't want to see that 50-50 threshold. We don't want to see a competitive district if the demographics don't really support that. But Princeton Gerrymandering Project does do a really good job of analyzing partisan fairness. And they've given, I think, A's to 2 out of 3 maps and then a B to the 3rd map. So again, just would really say like these maps are like overwhelmingly, again, the term I would use is like adequate. Nothing that anyone is going to go running through the streets just saying, fantastic, we did it, guys, but also nothing super egregious, with one exception. So the piece about racial gerrymandering, I think is really, really important, and happy to do like a deep dive on questions about like whether, you know, partisanship or racial gerrymandering or anything that anyone might have particularly interested in. I know sometimes redistricting can be like so in the weeds that it can be like a little overwhelming, and I talk really fast anyways. But the racial gerrymandering piece, I just want to touch on for a second, because a couple other organizations did release maps, including the Virginia NAACP, and these maps are different than the maps that the special masters produced. So I would just add the caveat that I don't think that the maps that we've seen the special masters produce are inherently guilty of racial gerrymandering. And I think that they are simultaneously not particularly helpful in supporting racial equity across the state. So I don't think that these are examples of packing or cracking. I also think that they are not examples of particularly like supportive maps of racial equity. I think both of those things are existing at the same time within these maps. My organization was explicitly focused on racial and ethnic, or drawing districts to support racial and ethnic minorities across the state. These maps do not do that. I don't think anybody probably is surprised by that, but I would also just like add the note that it would not, I think, be unreasonable to expect nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations to, in either the next year or the next several years, to raise litigation on behalf of specific communities of color and specific communities of interest to better show equity within these maps. So I would say that, like, yes, these maps are adequate, and I think that they serve political and partisan fairness, and happy to answer any questions on those. I think there's a lot of room for growth from a racial equity standpoint, and I think we'll probably see action to see to that by like the nonprofit side through litigating and through courts within the next few years. That said, I just said a lot of words, so happy to take questions or happy to do a deep dive on anything I just said. Yeah, so I'm just gonna stop talking and I'll take any questions.